The summer the paddies dried to cracked mud and the cooperative's machines rusted at the field margins was the summer Mei Lin stood before 400 people in the village assembly hall and held in her hands a thing no one else in the valley possessed, a harvest, not a promise of one, not a projection on a government form, a harvest, weighed and tallied, sitting in 52 sacks of short-grain rice behind her on the threshing floor. And every person in that hall knew exactly what their own sheds held, which was almost nothing at all. The heat outside was the kind that arrives like the opening of a kiln door, and inside, where the ceiling fans turned without conviction and the smell of anxious men hung in the air, it was not much better. A man named Director Hu sat in the front row with his arms folded across his pale linen jacket and his face arranged into an expression of concern that had, if you watched it long enough, the quality of a mask worn over a much older expression, appetite. He had driven up from the prefecture in an air-conditioned vehicle. You could tell by the fact that he was not sweating. Mei Lin was sweating. Her hands were rough and dark from 5 months of work that nobody had watched except a child named Bao, and an old woman named Grandma Shu, and the 40 ducks whose names only Bao knew with any confidence. She looked at Director Hao, and then she looked at the 400 people who had called her ducks a waste, and her methods a joke, and she did not smile, but something in her face settled the way water settles when a stone is finally done sinking. The real verdict had already been delivered. The paddy had delivered it in the last week of August, in a language of root and seed that required no translation. This is only the accounting. She had come to the valley in March, in the early wet season, when the road from the highway was still passable, and the flooded fields were the color of pewter under a sky that could not make up its mind. She had come alone, in a truck she had borrowed from her uncle, and in the truck bed she carried 40 ducks in 3 wire crates, a hand tiller, 4 bales of rice seedlings wrapped in wet burlap, a box of tools, and the approximate sum of her savings, which she had spent on the ducks, the seedlings, the lease of a 5-acre paddy that no one else would touch, and the first 2 months of rent on a concrete house at the end of a lane that flooded so reliably the previous tenant had left a painted water line on the interior wall at knee height as a courtesy or a warning or both. She had 1,100 yuan left. The arithmetic was not complicated. At 1,100 yuan and a lease payment due in 60 days, she had enough to fail twice and not enough to fail 3 times. She was 31 years old and she had farmed nothing in her life except a 1/4-acre kitchen plot at her parents' house in Hunan province, and she knew it, and she did not pretend otherwise, even to herself. The paddy she had leased was called the Old Shen Field by the people who had known it when it still grew rice, which was a period that had ended some years before her arrival. 3 previous tenants had tried it, and 3 had given up. The problem, as everyone explained to her in the days after she arrived, was that the Old Shen Field was a water trap. The soil beneath it was a seam of blue clay that drained at the rate of a grudge, and in a wet season the field held water 2 feet deeper than neighboring paddies, and the weight of a rotary tiller turned in that mud would bog a machine past retrieval in under 10 minutes. The cooperative's tractors, the self-propelled transplanters, the mechanical harvesters that the other families used without thinking, all of them were useless in Old Shen. You would have to transplant by hand, harvest by hand, and carry the grain out on your back across the berm, because no vehicle could approach the field's edge without the edge slumping into the water. When she walked the berm for the first time, she understood that every word of this was true. The field smelled deep and organic and slightly sulphurous, the way very old mud smells, the way something that has been sitting still for a long time smells when you disturb it. She stood at the center of the berm, and the water came to the tops of her boots, and she looked out over 5 acres of the most inconvenient land in Jiangxi province, and she said nothing out loud. But she did not leave. The verdict of the village on her enterprise was delivered within a week, formally and collectively, at the feed store beside the cooperative office, where she went to price chicken mash and wire fencing. There were 4 men drinking tea at a plastic table outside the store, and they watched her unload her list and watched the shop owner work through it, and one of the 4, a large prosperous man named Old Feng, who ran 40 acres of standard paddy on mechanized schedule and had a son at the agricultural college in Nanchang, said in a voice pitched for carrying that she ought to save the wire fencing money and spend it on bus fare home. The others laughed. The shop owner did not laugh, but he did not look up from his abacus. Someone said she bought the old Shen field. There was a silence of the kind that contains a great deal of suppressed laughter, and then Old Feng said, I heard she brought 40 ducks to farm it, and someone else said, 40 ducks and 5 acres, and Old Feng said, a woman alone with 40 ducks and a mud hole, and then the laughter was not suppressed any more. She bought the wire fencing. She did not look at the men at the table. She loaded the fencing into the truck, and she drove back to the flooded lane, and she sat in the truck for a long time, looking at the painted waterline on the house wall through the open door, calculating. The arithmetic she ran was not the arithmetic of savings. It was the arithmetic of indignation, which has no standard unit, but which accumulates compound interest in the dark. The ducks came out of the crates the following morning, and she let them into the paddy field through a gap she had cut in the temporary wire she'd stretched along the berm. And for a long moment they stood in a cluster at the water's edge, with the alert, slightly offended expressions of creatures who are deciding whether this is acceptable. Then the largest of them, a Muscovy drake with a caruncled red face and a disposition of absolute composure, walked into the water without ceremony, and the other 39 followed him because that is what the others always did. She watched them work the field. She had read about integrated rice duck farming in a pamphlet she had found at the provincial library in Changsha 8 months before coming to the valley, and the pamphlet had been brief and old, and she had taken it seriously in a way that a person who has very few options takes a thin document very seriously. The ducks ate the weed seedlings that were already threading up through the mud. They ate the insect larvae. They churned the surface with their paddling feet, aerating the blue clay in a way that no rotary tiller could replicate at that depth without sinking. They ate the apple snails that devastated rice in flooded fields throughout the province, the same snails that had been the quiet ruin of the second of Old Shen's 3 previous tenants, who had not admitted it to anyone, but whose empty snail shells still crunched underfoot along the berm, and as the ducks worked, their droppings dissolved into the water column and fed the paddy in a slow, continuous way that a single application of broadcast fertilizer never could. She watched all of this. She took notes in a small notebook with a pencil she kept behind her ear. She was almost entirely alone. She transplanted the seedlings herself, standing in the field in hip waders, bending and setting and moving and bending again for 12 hours a day across 9 consecutive days. And on the 9th day, she sat on the berm at dusk with her hands so cramped she had to pry her fingers straight one at a time, and she ran the arithmetic again. 60 acres of neighboring paddy transplanted by cooperative machinery in 3 days, and 5 acres of hers done in 9. And her back felt like something had been unscrewed from the inside. The large Muscovy drake swam past her feet and regarded her with one orange eye, and then swam on, which was not exactly encouragement, but was a kind of company. She decided it was enough. The old woman appeared on a Tuesday in late March. She materialized at the end of the lane in the early morning before the mist had fully lifted, a small woman in a dark jacket and rubber boots, carrying a bunch of water spinach in one hand and walking with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has been walking without hurry for several decades. She was Grandma Shu, and she lived in the low house at the bend in the lane that backed up against the lychee grove, and she had farmed wet rice in Zhejiang province for 40 years before following her daughter to this valley, and her daughter had moved to the city 3 years ago and left her behind, and she did not especially resent this. She leaned on the fence post, and she looked at the ducks in the paddy, and she said nothing for long enough that Maylene began to wonder if she had come to say something or simply to look. Then she said, in a Zhejiang accent that softened all the consonants and made every statement sound like something remembered from a long time ago, "You are listening to the field." Good. Most people only talk to it. Maylene said she was not sure she had it right yet. The old woman said, "The field does not whisper to the loud." She meant the machines. She meant the way the cooperative's tractors arrived at the field edge and applied to the soil a kind of blunt industrial insistence that the soil of Old Shen had been declining in its slow clay way for years. She pulled a snail from the fence post and held it up. She said, "Your ducks are eating what the machines could not even see. This is how the field will show you what it needs. You must only keep watching." She left the water spinach on the fence post and walked back up the lane. She came back the next morning and the one after that, and after 2 weeks she was coming every morning and sometimes staying until the light was gone, and she taught Maylene which duck behaviors meant the water was too acidic and which meant the dissolved oxygen was dropping, and which simply meant that a duck was being a duck and should not be medicalized. She said, "Every living thing in your field is reading the field and reporting what it reads. You are only the one who writes it down." The boy came in April. He was 10 years old and his name was Bao, and he lived with his grandmother 2 fields over because his parents were in Guangdong, working in electronics assembly, and sent money home at irregular intervals. He appeared at the berm one afternoon and watched the ducks for 45 minutes without speaking, and then said, "That big one with the red face, what's his name?" Maylene said she had not named any of them. The boy looked at her with the politely incredulous expression of a 10-year-old who has identified a significant oversight. He named the drake Old General. He named the others over the following 2 weeks in a taxonomy that was partly descriptive and partly literary, and entirely confident. There was Mudfoot, who waded shallow and ate slow. There was Seven, who was the 7th to follow Old General into any new section of the paddy and never deviated from this rank. There was a small speckled female he called Ink, whose bill was dark and whose work rate was the highest of any duck in the field, whom Maylene came to watch with particular attention because Ink always worked the areas of highest snail concentration first, as if she had run her own small analysis of the field and arrived at an independent conclusion. Bao came to the paddy every afternoon after school and every morning in the summer, and he carried the feed bucket when it needed carrying, and he reported duck health with a specificity and solemnity that would have been remarkable in an adult. He did not think her ducks were useless. He thought Old General was magnificent, which was a fair assessment. In May, a man came from the cooperative office. He was not the director, not yet, but he was a type that precedes the director, a smooth-faced man in clean clothes who drove up in a white car and stood at the edge of the lane and declined to approach the paddy berm because of his shoes, which were the shoes of someone who does not intend to step in anything difficult. He said the cooperative had noted her lease on Old Shen and wanted her to know that if she found the operation challenging, which he understood she might given the field's history, and given that she was, he paused here and produced a phrase from behind a sympathetic expression. Operating independently, there was an arrangement available. The cooperative could absorb the lease. She would receive a payment, he said, that reflected a realistic valuation of the field's productivity. She asked how much. He named a figure. It was less than her seedling deposit. He said the cooperative would also ensure she had a letter of reference for future agricultural employment, which he presented as a significant addendum. She said thank you and told him she was staying. He said he understood and that the offer would remain open. The way he said it made the offer sound less like kindness and more like a deadline. June was hard. The early summer rains came late and thin, and the paddy ran low, and she had to manage the water inlet valve twice daily to keep the depth correct for the ducks and for the tillering rice, which was reaching the stage of growth where the right water level mattered the way the right temperature matters to a fever patient. A few centimeters wrong in either direction, and something irreversible begins. She slept 4 hours some nights. The arithmetic she ran was starker than the March version. 2 months remained on her first full lease payment, 8,300 yuan, and she had 4,000 in the account, and no secondary income, and no one to borrow from who had both the means and the inclination. She did not tell anyone this. She told Grandma Shu she was managing well, and the old woman looked at her the way she looked at the ducks when she was assessing health, which was directly and without comfort, and said, "You are managing. This is not the same as well, but it is enough. Do not borrow against the harvest before the harvest is certain. Let the field hold its secret until the secret is ready to speak." And then the field whispered. In the third week of June, when she pushed aside the surface water near the base of the eastern berm with her hand to check the root structure of a clump of seedlings she suspected of zinc deficiency, she found under the clay lip of the berm's outer face a seep of cold, clean water at a rate she had not expected, fresh and cold, in a way that flooded paddy water is never cold, which meant it was not surface water, which meant it was coming from below, which meant that Old Shen Field was sitting on or adjacent to a subsurface spring or aquifer contact that none of the 3 previous tenants had noticed because none of the 3 previous tenants had pushed their hand under the berm in June. She stood up, and she did not shout. She stood for a long time looking at her wet hand. Then she went and got her notebook, and she wrote down the time and the location and the approximate flow rate in terms she could estimate. And then she went back to closing the inlet valve, because the field was already at the right depth, and she did not need to tell the field what she had found. The field already knew. She would know it too, quietly, and keep it the way you keep a coal banked low under ash, fed just enough air to stay alive, visible to no one, ready when the time requires it. She did not mention the seep to anyone, not to Grandma Shu, not to Bao. She adjusted her water management around it silently, letting it compensate for the low summer rains in a way that looked, from the road, like ordinary irrigation discipline. The rice grew, the ducks worked. Ink continued her independent audit of the snail population with unflagging industry. Old General continued to be the first into every new section and the last out of it. And the orderliness of the flock's movement through the paddy, which Grandma Shu called the field's walking mind, maintained an efficiency in the soil oxygenation and weed suppression that Maylene was now tracking in data columns in her notebook alongside water temperature, pH estimates, and duck weight averages. The paddy was not visibly remarkable. From the road it looked like a wet field with some ducks in it, which is precisely what it was. It did not announce itself. In July, a buyer came through the valley. He was a chef's purchasing agent from a restaurant group in Hangzhou that specialized in heritage grains and traditional production methods, and he was traveling the river districts looking for short grain varieties grown without synthetic inputs, which he said his clients would pay a significant premium for, and he had heard from a provincial agricultural extension officer that there was one operation in the valley using integrated duck cultivation. He found her at the field at 6 in the morning. He waded out onto the berm without hesitation and looked at the paddy and at the ducks and at her notebooks, which she showed him because he asked, and because something about the directness of his attention made her feel that he was looking at the field and not at the version of the field that people expected to see. He asked her estimated per-mu yield. She told him her figures. He looked at the notes carefully, and then he looked at the rice, and he said, "This is going to be better than you think." He offered a contract at a price per gin that was double the cooperative's standard purchase rate, and asked for right of first refusal on the full harvest. She said she would think about it. He said he understood and gave her his card and said the offer was real and was not going anywhere. She put the card in her notebook. She did not call him that day. She called him a week later after she had run the arithmetic 6 times and confirmed that it closed the lease gap with room remaining, and she said yes, and he said good. Old General swam past during the call, moving with his customary unhurried dignity, and she thought, yes, good. She told no one the terms. She told Grandma Shu she had a buyer confirmed, and the old woman nodded, as if this had been foreseen in a long-ago calculation whose results she had been keeping to herself. She told Bao that the ducks had done excellent work, and Bao said he knew because Ink had told him, which was Bao's way of saying that he had observed Ink's behavior and drawn a conclusion, which was in every practical sense accurate. August began, and with it the heat, and the heat arrived in the valley not gradually but fully, the way a door opens onto a kiln, and in the first week of August it was 38 degrees at 6 in the morning, and the paddy water was warm to the shoulder, and the rice was 2 weeks from harvest, and the sky was a flat bleached white that predicted nothing about rain. It had not rained since the middle of June. The valley's standard paddies, which used mechanical transplanting at a shallower water depth, and which relied on rainfall and surface irrigation from the reservoir, began to show stress in the second week of August. The reservoir's outlet pressure was dropping, the cooperative's water allocation schedule went from weekly to rationed, and the drip stress in the shallow paddies began to show as pale discoloration at the leaf tips of the rice, which is the rice's way of writing its own distress in a text that every farmer recognizes and dreads. By the third week of August, the discoloration had deepened, and the cooperative held an emergency meeting at which Director Howe, who had arrived in the valley for the first time in 2 months, with the urgency of a man who manages his presence to match his leverage, presented a consolidation proposal. The cooperative would take on distressed leases at assessed emergency value, pool the remaining water allocation, and harvest cooperatively, with revenues distributed by percentage. Several families signed immediately. Several asked for time. Old Feng, whose 40 acres had taken the drought hard because 40 acres of shallow paddy in dry heat requires a volume of water whose arithmetic Old Feng did not enjoy running, sat in the front row of that meeting and said nothing, which was unusual, and went home and looked at his fields, and came back and sat at his plastic table outside the feed store and looked at nothing for an hour. Director Hu sent the smooth-faced man back to see Mei Lin on the 21st of August. This time the smooth-faced man did come down the berm, shoes and all, because the urgency of his errand had overridden his caution about his shoes. He said the cooperative needed to know her water status. She said the field was fine. He looked at the paddy, which was at the correct depth, and at the ducks, which were working steadily, and at the rice, which was 2 weeks from harvest and showing none of the leaf stress that the rest of the valley's paddies were showing, and he said, "You have a water source that isn't the reservoir." She did not answer. He said the cooperative would need to understand that source in order to assess equitable water distribution in a crisis allocation. She said she managed her water carefully. He said the cooperative office would be following up. He left with mud on his shoes and the quality of expression of someone who has failed to find the right handle on a door. She watched him go, and then she looked at her notebook, specifically at the entry from the third week of June, and she thought about the coal banked under the ash, and she thought, not yet, but soon. On the 24th of August, Old Feng came to her house after dark. He knocked on the door with the knock of a man who is not accustomed to knocking on other people's doors and who has had to decide to do it anyway, which is a specific kind of knock that sounds less like a request and more like a capitulation. She opened the door. He stood in the lane with his hat in both hands. He said his east field had gone into moisture stress past the recovery threshold, and he was going to lose it if he didn't get water into the root zone in the next 48 hours. He said he had heard she was managing fine. He did not say he was sorry for the feed store. He did not say he had been wrong. But he held his hat in both hands, and he stood in the lane in the dark, and neither of those things needed to be said, because the holding of the hat said them. She told him she would bring water from the seep to his east field berm at 5 in the morning. He said, "I can pay something," she said. "Bring a shovel, and that's payment enough." He did not say thank you. He put his hat on and walked back up the lane, and she heard the sound of his boots on the gravel getting quieter, and she closed the door, and she sat at the table, and ran the arithmetic one more time, and the arithmetic was generous enough, and she left it at that. He came at 5. She showed him the seep and how to channel it. She did not tell him the whole of what she knew about the subsurface water, but she showed him enough to give his east field a chance. His east field, as she had run the rough estimate, needed about what the seep could provide for 48 hours without compromising her own paddy's final 2 weeks, and this arithmetic, run at 4 that morning in her notebook, was the arithmetic that had permitted her to say yes the previous night. She had not said yes out of sentiment. She had said yes because the arithmetic allowed it, and because the arithmetic of consequence, which is longer and harder to calculate than the arithmetic of money, required it. She understood this the way the old woman had taught her to understand the field, not all at once, not loudly, but through patient daily attention to what was actually happening rather than to what you hoped or feared was happening. The harvest came in the first days of September. She harvested by hand over 6 days with bow, carrying loads, and Grandma Shue managing the threshing at the edge of the berm, and when the last sack was weighed and tallied, the total was 52 sacks of short-grain rice with a moisture content and grain plumpness that exceeded the standard cooperative grade by a quality rating that the Hangzhou buyer, when he arrived with his truck and his scale and his precise and unhurried way of assessing things, rated with a single word: excellent. He paid the contracted price. The amount, written in her notebook in the column beside the lease cost and the duck purchase and the seedling deposit and the wire fencing and the 1,100 yuan she had arrived with, produced a sum that was not a fortune, but was a vindication in the only notation the valley understood: currency. She did not tell anyone the number. But money speaks even when you say nothing, because the buyer's truck was a good truck, and the buyer's crates were labeled crates, and he loaded 52 sacks into it in clear daylight, and people saw. The Cooperative Village Assembly was called on the 8th of September. Director Hu had called it ostensibly to discuss water allocation for the second planting season, but the actual purpose, which everyone understood from the way he had been conducting meetings all week, was to formalize the cooperative's claim to water resources in the valley that were not currently registered in the collective inventory, which was the bureaucratic language for he had heard about the seep and he intended to nationalize it. He was a man who worked through process the way water works through rock, not dramatically but continuously, and the process he had prepared involved a provincial water resource ordinance that classified subsurface water sources on agricultural land as collective property subject to cooperative management, which was a real ordinance and a real classification, and which, applied mechanically, would have removed her control of the seep and placed it under the cooperative's allocation schedule, where Director Hu would manage it. He arrived at the assembly hall with documents. He was, as noted, not sweating. She arrived with 52 sacks. The hall was full. Old Feng was there, and his hat was on his head this time because he was among the gathered rather than standing alone in a lane at night. And hats in public are a different matter than hats held in both hands in the dark. Grandma Shue sat near the back, small and still. Bao sat beside her with the complete attentiveness of a 10-year-old who understands that something important is being decided. The smooth-faced man sat beside Director Hu with a folder. Director Hu spoke first, at length, about collective resources and community resilience and the orderly management of water in a crisis that had affected the whole valley. And his voice carried the warmth of a man who knows he has the documents. He did not look at her while he spoke. When he finished, he looked at her and smiled and said he wanted to acknowledge her good management of a difficult field and proposed that the cooperative formalize a water-sharing agreement that would allow the community to benefit from whatever subsurface resources her land accessed, with appropriate compensation naturally. She let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, "What figure did you report to the allocation office for my seep's flow rate?" He paused. He said he had estimated it based on field observation. She said, "You reported 60 liters per hour," he said, "approximately." She said, "The actual measured rate is 41 liters per hour, measured by my record since the 21st of June, documented daily. I have never told anyone that number." His pause was brief, but it was there, and the people in the hall heard the brief pause. And in the brief pause, the smooth-faced man's folder became a slightly different kind of document. Old Feng took his hat off, not to bow, just to hold it. She said, "You had someone measure the seep without my knowledge or permission." He began to speak about the public interest. She said, "The public interest." She let that phrase rest in the heat of the room. Then she said, "I will share the water." She said she had already shared it with the East Field and could arrange a channeling system for 3 neighboring paddies that would give each a supplemental flow sufficient for a second planting. She said she would accept labor in return, not payment, because she had next season's planting to do, and her hands were only 2. She said the cooperative's management was not part of the arrangement. She looked at Director Hu when she said this. She did not raise her voice. She said, "The seep is on my lease." The ordinance he had cited applied to development permits, not to existing agricultural leases with water access rights predating the ordinance's adoption, which she had confirmed with the Provincial Land Office at the end of August, which was also something she had not mentioned to anyone, which was the second coal she had been keeping banked and low under the ash. She had done this quietly, sitting in the Provincial Land Office in the city on a day when everyone thought she was at the market, and the officer she had spoken to had given her the confirmation in writing, which was in the notebook she was holding. Director Hu looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has reached for a door and found a wall. Then he folded his documents. He said there were other matters to discuss. But the hall was done with other matters. The movement that went through 400 people at that moment was not dramatic. It was the small particular movement of people who have reoriented, the way a flock of birds reorients in flight when the lead bird changes direction, not all at once and not noisily but completely. Old Feng said from the middle of the room that he could confirm the water arrangement worked, and the way he said it, plainly and without preamble, was the closing of an account between them that had been opened since the feed store. Several other men spoke in the same register. Director Ho gathered his documents and his assistant and his air-conditioned certainty and left the hall before the meeting formally closed, which was its own kind of verdict. Grandma Shu came to the paddy the morning after the assembly, as she always did, in the early mist, before the day had committed to being warm or cool. She stood at the berm and watched old General lead the ducks in their first pass of the morning across the far edge of the paddy, where the rice had been cut but the water remained and the duck work of aerating and feeding continued, because ducks do not stop working when the harvest is done. They continue. That is their nature. The old woman said, "The field holds what the farmer forgets. You did not forget." Mei Lin said she had nearly forgotten in June, in the hard weeks. And the old woman said, "Nearly is not the same as did, and this is the whole of what I have to teach you." They stood together in the mist and did not say anything else for a long time. Bao arrived 20 minutes later with his school bag and a handful of water spinach he had pulled from the edge of the canal, which he offered to Ink, who accepted it with the professional efficiency of a duck, who has a great deal to accomplish today and cannot spare much time for sentiment. Bao watched her eat, and then looked at the paddy and said, "Will you do all 40 acres next season?" Mei Lin looked at him. She said she had been thinking about 3 more, which would keep the operation within what she and the ducks and the available labor could manage well. And managing well was different from managing large, and she had learned that difference here. Bao nodded, satisfied. He said Old General needed a larger section of the new paddy because he worked best in open water with room to run a full circuit, and she said she had noticed that too, and had already allowed for it in her planning. Bao looked at her with the expression that meant she had passed his assessment. He picked up the feed bucket and carried it to the berm, and scattered the morning measure in a wide arc that Old General led the others through in their customary ordered way. The rains came in the second week of September, not enormous rains, but real ones, slow and steady and decided, and the valley smelled for 3 days of things beginning again: wet dust, wet grass, wet soil, turning over whatever it had been keeping to itself all summer. The paddies that had survived the drought, which were the ones that had managed carefully, and the ones that had shared the seep water, and a few fortunate others, began their preparation for a second planting. The ones that had not survived sat fallow, and their lessees would need to renegotiate, and some of them would succeed and some would not. And this was the arithmetic of farming that had no clean solution, only the ongoing working of it. Old Shen Field took the rein with the composure of something that had not needed to worry. The seep continued below the berm, 41 liters per hour, faithful as memory. Grandma Shu planted water spinach along the edge of the berm where the runoff made the soil rich, and it grew with the quick, confident enthusiasm of something that has found exactly the conditions it requires. Mei Lin sat at her table in the evenings and wrote in her notebook the plans for the following season. 3 additional acres to bring the total to 8, a second wire run along the north berm, a plan for rotating the ducks through sections so that Old General's preference for open water was accommodated, and Ink's preferred snail grounds were maintained. A budget that for the first time since March carried more columns on the right side of the ledger than the left. She wrote down the names of the 3 families whose paddies would share the seep channeling arrangement, and beside each name she wrote the labor arrangement she had proposed, and the numbers added up cleanly on both sides, the way numbers do when they are built on something real. She wrote down Grandma Shu's aphorism about the field not whispering to the loud, and she wrote it in the margin and drew a small line under it, which is what she did in her notebooks with things she wanted to keep. She wrote down Bao's census of the duck flock, which he updated every 2 weeks, with annotations on health and behavior that were, she had come to believe, the most accurate running record of the paddy's condition available to her. She wrote 40 ducks, 5 acres, 1 season. Then she crossed out 1 season and wrote start. Outside the window the lane was quiet, and the lychee grove at the bend was dark and full of evening sounds, and the water along the flooded margin of the road ran clean and quick in the first real rain in 3 months, and somewhere in the paddy, in the dark, Old General was swimming his last circuit of the evening with the unhurried authority of something that has never once doubted that it belonged exactly where it was,